Hi, everyone. My name is Rebecca Tucker. My sign name is Rebecca, and I'm going to be presenting my language toolkit for our capstone project for this program. My official title is Language Toolkit DHH Infant and Toddler Strategies. So, my goals for this project was to create 10 parent friendly materials that focus on language and building language in the brain. So I wanted to focus on the tip, why it's important, and the research behind it, and then practical ways to use it in the natural environment, which is really important in early intervention. And I broke that down into two things. So I will show you in a second these 20 tips that we use in Georgia that are called Feeding Your Child's Brain. And I supplemented and consolidated and created 10 tips for language nutrition. And then I wanted to create a resource to discuss all of those 10 tips. This is a major quote that drove my project and the strategies I chose. So kind of if you boil down every strategy that I chose, it goes back to this, which is the most important factor in children's language development is the quality and quantity of the language they hear from their caregivers and in their environments. So I mentioned our program's website or what our program uses. There are these 20 tips. You can kind of see them over to the right, each one. And they're great tips. And they're very specific. But the way that we present them on the website looks like this. So you go to the tips, and then you have to click on the sidebar to reach each one of them. And there's bullet points of how to do the tip. And there's a bottom line. But these aren't printable. And I don't find that they're very parent friendly because there's no simple way to direct a parent to one specific tip that an early interventionist might want to work on during a session with the family. So you would just send them to the whole site and be like, go check on tip number 13, which I don't find to be very helpful. When you try to pull it up on your phone, you can't screenshot it to use it later. You can't print it, which is not printable or shareable. There's a lot of them, and it can be really overwhelming to figure out how to use them. And then as I work with families, try to find tangible resources to share with my families. And I want them to be parent friendly with simple vocab, but in depth so that they know exactly what they're supposed to do. I want it to have a description of exactly what kind of activities they can do in the home. I want it to be pretty unbiased. It's hard to find a lot of tips or a lot of resources to give to families that emphasize whole language and giving a child full access to language. What I end up finding is a lot of speech-based resources, and that's it. There's not a lot that includes sign language. There's not a lot that includes visual learning. And I wanted to have it be able to be used with spoken language, but I wanted to focus on language in general and how a family can use this no matter what language they're speaking. So as we've learned a little bit, and as I've seen in my work as an early intervention specialist, parents go on a journey with their communication, with children's communication modalities, and children are going to communicate differently with whoever they're with, different people that they're with. And so these tips that I designed, I made sure that no matter where a family is on the communication spectrum, that they're able to use these. I didn't want it to be age dependent. I find a lot of resources that have ages listed, or they're very specific. They're like much more difficult tasks for older toddlers, for preschoolers. And it's really hard to break that down for families to understand that they can be doing these language strategies with infants. And I wanted to be able to use it no matter the age or really where the child was in their language journey. And then, just wanted it to be used regardless of age. So these are all the things that I used, and how my project went. Took the 20 tips, really broke them down, figured out what each one was trying to say and how I could lump them together. And then I researched a lot of different, um, I used a lot of different research articles and then used some other handouts that are currently being used. So, for example, the Atlanta Speech School in Atlanta, they have something called habit cards, which are 10 tips for parents to use in the home, but they're very spoken language driven, and I find that I can't give them to all of my families. So I looked at them to see what kind of research they found important, based some of mine off of that, and then pulled from a lot of other different research articles. So the 20 tips that are on our website were my core, and then I supplemented with all of these other things that are listed. So for my SLOs, the one that I chose to talk about, that I think is really fundamental in this project specifically, is for candidates to describe strategies for achieving outcomes in children and families, and describing strategies that promote the acquisition of language for children birth to 3 using an array of communication modalities and techniques. So I talked about that a little bit. I made sure that my tips were accessible across all communication modalities and technologies. So no matter if, a family is aiming for a cochlear implant and right now they have a hearing aid and they're learning sign until they get the implant, or whatever else the technology and the communication modality looks like, they can use these. So we have auditory and visual approaches on every single sheet. And none of them rely on auditory access, which is something that I found in my research. A lot of the resources that currently exist, at least one of the tips or at least one of the handouts in this packet would have to be relying on auditory access. And I just didn't want any part of it to rely on auditory access. So it really supports all forms of language access. And it is, like I said before, it's very flexible for families that are exploring or transitioning between communication options. That you can still refer back to this even when a family changes how their communication modality looks with their child. You can say, well, here, let's revisit this tip that we already talked about, and this is still true. And this is how we can still use this tip, even though we're switching up how we're communicating. And for my dispositions, I wanted to focus on family involvement. So these handouts aren't handouts for EISs necessarily. They are, I created them for EISs to use, but it's not information for them. It's for the family. And so the intention is that they would go in the home and they would show the parent this and do whatever activity with the parent and involve them in an activity that they already do. There's lots of examples, but then kind of you can pivot from the example and think of like, okay, well, the family might not do this, but this is another way that they could do it, and involve them in every single tip. And I think it's really important for the EIS to also ask the family, you need to, they're the ones using it in their daily life. So it's like, what do you do almost every day that you think would fit with this? So if we're talking about this strategy, where do you think that this would fit? Do you think you would be able to do it during bedtime? Do you think you'd be able to do it during a mealtime? And asking the family and getting them involved in making the decision for when a tip can be used. Because if the family doesn't understand how they're going to use it, or if they say, great, you gave me an example to use it at bedtime, but that's the most hectic part of my day, I'm not thinking about language at that point, then it's not going to be useful or helpful for the family. So getting them involved and asking what would be helpful to them is how it's going to be helpful for their child. And then applying evidence-based research. I did a lot of research into different articles and what the research is saying infants need. So the four major research articles, research groups that I used were the Joint Committee on Infant Hearing, Hands and Voices FL3, the NCHAM book, and state lead K programs were also pretty helpful because they use a lot of research-based information. So just a little bit about how I designed each page. It starts with a description of the strategy, the why are we doing this, what's the research say, and then how, which is practical examples of how to use it. And this is my cover sheet. It's almost like a table of contents. So this is the very first page of the packet. And then I have the 10 tips. We won't dive into every single one of them because we don't have time. I would be happy to provide the PDF copy to anybody that wants it. But I'll go over just a couple of the strategies. So the share the focus, this number 2 one is one of my favorites. It's joint attention. And at the top of each handout, I do have a quote that fits in. So the one for this one is providing language input that is directly relevant to the child's focus and of attention has an effect on language acquisition. So where a child is focused is going to direct what kind of language they have access to. So then I explain what is joint attention. So when a caregiver and child share a focus on an object or an activity and then look at each other and go back and forth between looking at an object and looking at each other. And it's a lot of following your child's interest and engaging in what they're interested in. And then just a short little thing about what the research shows, because families don't need to know all the dense research, but I did want them to understand why this is important. So for example, that one says, research shows following a child's interest and creating moments of connection strengthens the bond between you and your child, social skills, and emotional awareness. So that's why we're doing it. I'm not just throwing out these random tips. I wanted parents to understand why it's important. And then here is a list of different ways to try it out. And so families might not necessarily connect with every single one. They're all very valid, but maybe they can pick just one activity, or some of my families want to try different ways to do it. And so talking about following the child's lead, give something to draw attention to one spot that both of the parent and the child can look at. Holding your baby so that their face is right in front of the parent's face is a really good way. Sorry. No, that was not what I meant to say. Holding them out so that they can see what you see is very crucial. It's also very important for them to make eye contact, which is the first one, starting strong and connecting. So I got those mixed up. So staring right at your baby would have been number 1, but having them face out, like looking down at them and being like, do you see that? And making the connection and pointing between them and whatever you're looking at, having them see what you see is really important. It's also really good for theory of mind. Another way is, and then I explained that reading is a really good time to do that. So having the baby sitting in your lap and you're both looking at a book and you're pointing to pictures and they're seeing what you're seeing on the book is a great way to do this. Labeling feelings can share an attention on how they feel. And then you're sharing the experience with them. Point to objects that are right in their viewpoint. So if there's something in front of them and you're pointing to it to try to draw their attention and then you're looking at them. Sequential interaction, which is a fancy word that I then broke down, but it's making sure the child is looking at you before you start a conversation about something, which is really crucial with visual language. If the child's not looking at you, they're not going to access the language. So making sure that they're looking at you before you give the language or talk to them. And if they break eye contact, they're looking away, pause, look at what they're looking at, And then when they're ready to look back at you, start communication again. And then here's where I described or explained that it's all very good for theory of mind, which is understanding the another person's thoughts and emotions and viewpoints. So I'm just going to briefly talk about each one, but we're not going to go into any of the details. So like I said, the first one was Start Strong, Connect. It's all about eye contact and connecting with your child. Number 3 is exposing rich vocabulary, and it's like assuming competence. So assuming that a child can learn big words. Number 4 is expressing naturally and intentionally, making sure that you're really thinking about what kind of language you're exposing your child to and making sure that it's something that they should access naturally. Number 5 is communicate with expression, which is basically parentese. But I see this one. This one was, I wanted to make sure I focused on this one for the communication modalities, because a lot of time with parentese, you'll see people talking about, raising your pitch and how acoustic highlighting is something that I mentioned on here. And that's in a lot of the tips that I saw. But that in and of itself is hard when your child doesn't have as much auditory access. And so with this tip, I really made sure to think about communicating with expression is a broader way to explain parentese, because most people don't talk about parentese in a visual way. And so there are some really good visual ways to do parentese in that tip. Number 6 is prompt and pull. It's really just setting up your child to communicate and then pulling language out of them. Number 7 is taking turns back and forth, which I explained kind of like a game of tennis, and making sure that you're doing back and forth communication with your child, that you're initiating it and expecting them to serve it back to you. But then also that whenever they serve communication to you, that you're meeting their need and you're communicating back. Number 8 is expand and add. So if a child has a little bit of communication, they say one word or they sign one word, that a parent then expands on it and gives them more language than what they started with. Number 9 is reading. And so this has tons of tips about reading and reading to babies and why it's important. And then number 10 is share joy. And so my biggest takeaway with that one was that I think a lot of times parents can feel like therapists, and that's not their job. Like, yes, expose your child to language, but you're also there to be their parent and enjoy them. And I think that it's not talked about enough. And I wanted to save a whole tip to be able to focus on that with a family. So for my reflections, I think my biggest reflection is that I am reminded that learning is always ongoing. Even if I felt at the end of all my tips that I exhausted every research article I could find and every handout I could find, there's always going to be more there and new research put out, later on. So for example, I have the SAS Lehrer book, and we've been using it this whole program, but there is a table, it's table 8.1 that's been there this whole time, and yet I didn't see it until after I created all of my tips and presented at Eddie. And then for my other class this semester, we had to go deep dive into that. I was like, well, this is literally my capstone project, like the groundwork for my capstone project. And so I really wish I had read that chapter sooner or paid attention to that chapter sooner, because it would have been a great resource for my handouts. And so I wish that I had seen it sooner, but I also, if I ever go back and decide to kind of tweak any of the tips, I definitely want to see how to include that. And they do overlap, but it just would have been good to be able to cite that before creating the handouts. And then when I went to the Eddie conference and I presented this, because I did present this at Eddie, there was a huge emphasis on the DCEI, DHH at Eddie. And when I started researching it and looking into it and hearing everybody talking about it, I saw that there was a huge like a big overlap of what I had put in my handouts and what they were talking about. And so it really affirmed a lot of my strategies, but there were a couple that would have been interesting to try to include in there. And so those I listed right there. Like, well, the waiting for attention I did put in there, but I think I could have highlighted it better. Eliminating noise and improving lighting were all things that I think I probably could have added, and I wish I would have. Future directions. I would love to know what other resources are needed. These are pretty cut and dry. I think they could be edited. I definitely need to translate them into Spanish. My supervisor at the Department of Education has approved for us to get them translated into Spanish. And then I need to figure out how to provide those to all the people that already have them in English and all the programs, because I've had a lot of programs ask to use these and put them on their website and give them to their EISs to use. So then figuring out how to roll out the Spanish version to them is something I'm going to have to figure out. But then I do want to know, what else? Because this stemmed from me thinking, what do I miss when I'm going to go see a family? What do I need? And this is what I felt like I needed the most. But then I'm sure that there are many other EISs that have that kind of question and experience for other things. So that's kind of one of my questions is what else is needed? What other concepts are totally being missed that we don't we know about it, but we don't have something to hand a family about it. And then I kind of also thought of some other resource ideas. So hearing status impact, receptive versus expressive communication, optimal listening environment, which I'm going to talk about in the last slide. And then just general development for infant and toddlers. And then curriculum scopes, kind of just looking at where does this fit into an EIS serving a family? Where do they use this? When do they use this? How do they use this? Which I think is up to every program, but it would be interesting to look into it in relation to this. So here are all my references. I have 2 pages of them because there's a good amount. Thank you. And I have QR codes to access them. And a lot of people have also just emailed me to ask for a PDF copy of them.